In this video, I'm going to show you how to take in an already existing skirt. These methods can be used for any type of skirt, but in this example, I'm using a skirt with a back zip and no stretch to the fabric. For this project, you're going to need thread, a seam ripper, measuring tape, pins, scissors, and your skirt. My skirt has a slight facing at the top, which I think most skirts usually do, so I'm going to start by using my seam ripper to unstitch that facing. You want to be really careful during this step as to not rip any of the fabric. Here I'm showing a tempting technique to do with the seam ripper, but it often creates holes in the fabric. All skirts are made differently, and your skirt may not have a facing or may have lining, and it may look a little different than this, but the main point of this part is to detach whatever band you have around the top of the skirt from the skirt. In my skirt, there's a top stitching on the facing, which is pretty common, and you're going to have to unstitch that as well. Deconstructing garments is a good way to learn about how clothes are made. In this case, for instance, there's an interfacing on the facing, the top stitch. There's a lot that can be learned with the different techniques that different brands use. And then you can use those techniques when making your own garments. I now have my facing detached from my skirt. I'm now going to place my skirt inside out on my mannequin and start taking it in with pins at the side seams. You can also easily do this pinning on yourself if you don't have a mannequin. If you're struggling with getting the fit that you like by just pinning it in at the side seams, you can also place darts in the back. Those darts can be placed on either side of the zipper. My skirt has quite a few seams, which makes it really easy to take in evenly around the skirt, but if yours doesn't, again, the dart technique could be used. It's important to use your measuring tape at this stage as well to make sure that all the pins that you're placing are symmetric and even. Another important thing to remember when placing your pins is that they really nicely line up with the seam edge and aren't creating any angles as shown here. This angle would create a funny pucker on the outside of the skirt, so you want to make sure when placing your pins that they're aligning smoothly with the already existing seams. And that'll be the case when placing pins for your darts as well, making sure there's no drastic angles that will show through on the other side of the skirt. Before you do any of the sewing, it's important to try on your skirt again and make sure that you like the fit of your newly placed pins. Then you're ready to sew with a straight stitch along where you placed your pins. If your skirt fabric has any stretch at all, I suggest to use a zigzag stitch. Now you can trim away all the extra fabric on the outside of those seams that you just sewed. If your fabric is prone to fraying, you may want to finish the edges with a zigzag stitch. I like doing this stitch, making sure that the needle's going on the outside of the fabric to lock in those loose threads. We're now ready to reattach our facing. My facing had a piece of cord that I'm just going to remove because it got damaged by the seam ripper. So as you can see, a facing piece usually has quite a bit of curve, so we're going to make sure that we're lining up the curve with the skirt, which means lining up the center of the facing to the center of the skirt and making sure that it's curving then upwards towards the back of the skirt. And because we took in the skirt, the facing should be a little longer. If it's quite a bit longer, you may want to place pins and take it in a little bit throughout to maintain the curve of this piece. In my case, taking it in just at the ends is going to be totally okay and won't mess with the curve of the skirt. Okay, now we're going to move on to the repinning around the zipper. So remember, we're placing right sides together. We want to make sure that the zipper is fully detached, there's no extra stitches locking it down, and we want to place the facing onto the zipper. So the teeth of the zipper now are inside the facing and the skirt. And you can test if you placed your pins correctly if you flip the skirt right side out and it looks like how the skirt's going to look. In my case, the facing was top stitched onto the skirt, which actually left quite a bit of holes. So I'm going to reattach my facing a little lower on the skirt so that I can cut away all those holes. This also just shows that you can really play around with the different techniques and make the skirt fit exactly how you like. So again, we're just reattaching the facing, this time just a little lower, and using the measuring tape to make sure that everything's even. And again, we really need to make sure that the zipper is completely detached from the skirt before we reattach the facing. And with our right sides together, we make sure the teeth are on the inside, and again, you can flip it right side out to make sure that all your pins are placed correctly. The raw edge of my facing was folded up 1 centimeter, and that's where they previously did the top stitch. You can finish this edge any way you like, whether that's with a top stitch, leaving it raw, or whatever works with your fabric. Now you're going to sew along all where you pinned with the straight stitch. And here you can see, to create a crisp corner, I'm pivoting my needle while sewing around the zipper. You can now trim away all the excess fabric, which in my case, because I lowered the facing, also includes trimming away a bit of the zipper. Depending on your fabric, you may need to play with it a little bit to flip it right side out and create that crisp corner edge. So now with our facing all attached, we're going to do a top stitch just like what was done before we took apart the skirt. You can see the mark on the fabric where the top stitch was previously sewn, and we're just going to sew along that line again, making sure that we're catching all the layers of seam allowance behind. It's important to iron out this seam before we sew our top stitch. And make sure that while we're ironing, we're pressing all of those raw edges towards the facing. And then you can sew along with a straight stitch. And as you can see here, the stitch caught all of those raw edges. Then we're going to go back and iron the facing down into its proper position. The reason for the top stitch is to help create the crisp edge around the top of the skirt. You can't see it, but it helps keep the facing in place. For good measure, I'm also going to do a couple stitches in the already existing seams to keep the facing in place. If your skirt just has side seams, that's totally fine. I also like to do zigzag stitches at the top of the zipper to make sure that the zipper is not going to come off, just because I did cut the zipper. So now I'm going to do all those stitches to lock in the facing and at the top of the zipper. The final step is optional, and it's just to hem the skirt. After trying it on, I measured the new length and then cut away the excess, keeping in mind seam allowance. I left 3 centimeters for seam allowance, so I folded my 1 centimeter over and ironed that down, and then folded over again 2 centimeters and again ironed it down. I also placed some pins to keep it in place before I sewed it. And then with a straight stitch, sewing on the right side of the skirt, I sewed my new hem. And you're all done! Thank you for watching, and if you liked the video, please subscribe.